Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. My apologies to everyone who watched with questions yesterday's episode when we reacted to episode 7, having not done chapter 6 yet. It had been a couple of days since I had done a previous one, and somehow just thought that's the chapter I was on, skipped completely over chapter 6. Put a a comment about that. Hopefully most of you caught that, but if you didn't, I'm sorry. Here's chapter 6. We're going to dive right into this. We're continuing on with the Turkish century. I do believe this is the episode where we will be talking about what is known as the Armenian genocide. As I have said before, I know that there are certain people who, much like Holocaust deniers, have this idea that it didn't happen. I don't have a lot of patience for that. I will delete your comments if you say it didn't happen. Now, we can have a conversation about what caused it, how many people died, who was to blame, those kinds of things. But the fact that a lot of people died, particularly on one side of this conflict, is not really in dispute. So let's just kind of put that out of our minds and see what we have to learn about this. As always, I'm relying on the community to be kind of the fillers in of information. This is not a topic I know a lot about. So add to the conversation. Use the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts about what he talks about here. Let's go ahead and dive in.
If you Google the Young Turks, the result you are going to get are mainly these clowns. A group of American left-wing pundits who named their show after the Young Turks. Why you would do that, I don't know. The result, however, is that this is what people think the Young Turks are, when the Young Turks were in fact someone else. It all started in the 1800s. After several military defeats, the Ottomans invited foreign military staff to train their military officers in newly built cadet schools in places like Thessaloniki. A generation of young Turkish officer cadets, as well as a generation of Turkish students of law and medicine, had the opportunity to travel abroad and study the newest insights in technology, military leadership, and laws abroad.
So we talked about this yesterday, even though that's now the episode after this one, that this is a common thing that seems to be happening at this time in history, where you have a lot of people who are traveling outside of their homes. And this is before the internet. This is a time before we have access to instant information, especially if you live in a society where there's not a lot of outside information getting in. And I'm not saying that's the case here in the Ottoman Empire. I'm just saying in general. If the means of information is largely controlled by the government, the only way you're really going to hear things that are different than what the government wants you to hear at this time is to go outside of that and to travel to other places. And so going to places like London and Paris, in places in the West, they're going to be exposed to a very different way of doing things, a very different way of society and life, and government even. So it's interesting to see how people bring things back to their homes and how they choose to try and implement those things.
And it convinced them that something had to radically change if the empire was to be saved. They formed underground organizations such as the Committee for Union and Progress, but they became more commonly known as the Young Turks. These revolutionaries believed that for the Ottoman Empire to survive, it needed to reform and adapt to a new world where it would take its equal place amongst European empires. At the turn of the century, the Ottoman Empire fell into another period of crisis. The Austrians occupied Bosnia, and dozens of rebellions flared up by Greeks, Armenians, Albanians, Macedonians, and Arabs.
Remember, it's been said multiple times that the Balkans are the powder keg of Europe. It's that area that for centuries now has been fought over, and it's kind of the border between Christian Europe and Islamic Asia in the Middle East. And, you know, so it's a natural battleground for those kind of conflicts to take place. And you've got all these small nations or groups of people that have different cultures, different languages, a mix of the religions kind of overlapping a little bit. And so just it's a very natural place for these things to take place.
Within all this mess, the Young Turks seized the opportunity to seize power in 1908. The Sultan was forced into signing away all political power and reinstate a constitution. The Ottoman Empire became a constitutional monarchy, but in no way became a democratic society. But their ascent to power did not slow down the decline. Instead, it encouraged outsiders to take advantage of the instability. An Albanian uprising, a war with the new Balkan states, and a war with Italy were the result. The Ottomans lost their last lands in the Balkans, as well as Libya and strategically important Aegean islands to the Italians. And the uprising in Albania foreshadowed what was to come in the following decade. After crushing the rebellion, the Young Turk government banned the Albanian language, Albanian alphabet, Albanian schools, and Albanian traditional dress.
So this, remember, we've been talking about how the Ottoman Empire had been kind of the picture of tolerance. Not necessarily giving full equality to different groups, but at least tolerating them and permitting them to exist and to keep their culture and their language and their religion and things like that. Well, now this is changing, and so they're starting to crack down on those things.
By 1913, power resided with a military triumvirate under the three Young Turk Pashas or military leaders, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. And with that, they also increasingly abandoned the idea that an empire of multiple ethnicities and faiths could successfully be preserved. Turkification was instead what they worked towards. As the Young Turks started to build a modern nation-state out of their empire, they sought new ideas and fictions around which to forge their new vision. The old ways, the ways of the religious hierarchy and Sharia, had to go. But what do we replace it with? The Young Turks adopted a nationalism through which they saw peoples in ethnic and lingual categories and classifications.
Isn't this interesting? It's kind of a foreshadowing of what happens in Germany in the 1930s, where you start to kind of classify people, and they start to do things like, okay, well, if you've got this much of this ethnicity, then you're considered this, and it's basically that whole idea of eugenics, a social hierarchy based on who you are and where you're from.
They started using the word Turk when describing themselves and the land most Turks lived in. While the Ottoman nobility may have spoken Persian, the Young Turks popularized the use of the Turkish language as a rebellion against the corrupt royal elites. This was an era of nationalist movements across the world trying to reaffirm and reassess cultural independence and identity. In Ireland, Gaelic cultural organizations formed, and playwrights wrote pieces like Kathleen Houlihan, which had the distinct purpose of separating Irishness from Britishness and rediscovering and reinventing an Irish cultural identity. In China, nationalists overthrew the Manchu monarchy and reinvented a new Han Chinese republican national identity. The Indian National Congress increasingly protested the British presence in India, and what happened in the Ottoman Empire was no different than the child of its time.
So yeah, that's an excellent point to make. This is hardly the only place these kinds of things are going on. Nationalism is a very strong movement at this point, and it will be for decades to come, but it looks different in different places, and it depends largely on who ends up becoming the leader of that movement. In a place like Germany, where you have very kind of violent people come to power, or people who are willing to do whatever it takes to take that power, it looks one way. In some other places, it might look very, very different, depending on the nature of the people who are given the reins of authority.
The Young Turks searched for national figures and heroes to reinvent a Turkish culture. The word Turk comes from a tribal name of the old Turkic era and means strength. They rediscovered a medieval Turkish poet and religious mystic, Yunus Emre, who broke with the standards and customs of his time by refusing to write poetry in Persian and refusing to preach religion in Arabic, instead doing so in the common Turkish language of the peasants. He was declared to be the father of the Turkish language, which, however, isn't really true. He just wrote in Turkish to reach more people. Young Turk leaders and politicians such as Ziya Gökalp defined the new Ottoman Empire as a society consisting of people who speak the same language, have the same education, and are united in their religious and aesthetic ideals.
So that means if you don't fall into those categories, you're really not a part of what we're doing here. If you don't speak our language, if you don't have our religion, if you don't have our values or the right education, you're on the outside looking in. So there's really no pretending anymore about this idea of inclusion. You've got to adapt and you've got to be a part of this or you're out.
And the problem with that increasingly spreading nationalism was that it left no room for others. Your ethnicity, your language, your faith, and the way you practiced your faith became increasingly relevant in this society. The Young Turks became increasingly racist over time, looking down on Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, and Alawites with increasing racialized contempt, as a people who supposedly refused to become part of the modern world, or as a foreign and enemy entity from within. With passing time, they became increasingly volatile and also delusional. Enver Pasha dreamt of a great Turkic empire stretching from the Balkans to China that he would conquer for a unified, ethnically Turkish empire.
So it's kind of interesting that on one hand, he wants to have an empire. He wants to grow the empire. But they're also demanding that people conform to their way of doing things. Whereas the empire at its height, at its strength, was... previously had been a time when it was a collective of all of these different organizations and groups and nationalities and ethnicities. And so he really wants to have the same power and the same kind of extent, but with a very different nature. And it's interesting to see how that didn't work out for him.
The idea in itself is nonsensical. The Turkic cultural sphere contains various different languages and cultural expressions. Even the notion of a Turkish race, after centuries of assimilations and integrations of different peoples, is purely nonsensical. Yet those facts did not delude the delusions of grandeur that some within the Young Turk ranks had come to believe. A Turkish empire was to be built, and those within it who were not Turks would have to assimilate into becoming Turks or go. The Young Turks aligned themselves with the German Empire, dressed like German officers and generals, and saw the German Empire as an exemplar model for how to build their new empire.
I will say this, I don't know if I agree with his take where he kind of keeps throwing up that whole word cultural genocide. I understand where he's coming from with that, I just don't agree with it. And maybe it's not fully understanding the nature of how this was implemented in Turkey. Wanting people to assimilate themselves into the culture of the place that they're going doesn't necessarily have to mean that you want them to eliminate their past. An example for me personally would say, I'm an American, I live in the United States, and there is kind of this desire that I think that people have when they come to the United States that we have, that they will kind of absorb themselves into the culture of the U.S., but at the same time be proud of your heritage. If you're Italian, I've got a neighbor right across the street who flies an American flag and an Italian flag, and he's obviously got Italian roots, and he's proud of that, and he should be. My wife's family's Hungarian, and they're proud of their Hungarian roots, and they should be. I'm very proud of my British roots, and I should be, but I am first and foremost an American. But maybe it's just a matter of me not fully appreciating just how far they went with this. I don't think that wanting people to assimilate automatically means cultural genocide. Now, wanting them to eliminate any sense of who they are, that's a different story.
As such, they helped drag the empire into the First World War, which first and foremost exposed one thing: their incompetence. Jamal Pasha marched south, intent to take Egypt from the British, lost, got bogged down, and took out his frustrations by mass hangings of Arabs and Assyrians, which resulted in the Arabs increasingly despising their Turkish overlords. Enver Pasha had the genius idea of invading Russia without preparing for the Russian winter, with predictable results.
I don't even know what to say there. Invading Russia without preparing for the Russian winter. Is that not the story of every person's life when they attack Russia? That somehow it's like nobody ever picked up a history book and said, you know what, maybe this is not the best idea. I don't know.
He came back and instead of taking responsibility, blamed the Armenians. Within the new nationalist vision for the Ottoman Empire the Young Turks had, the Armenians were, by not being Turkish and by not being Muslims, already separated from the remaining population as different. To emphasize the difference, even though claiming to abandon the old hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks took advantage of it by branding the Armenians as kuffar, or unbelievers, as beneath the Muslim population. The Armenians never rose above the status of being second-class citizens, even as the Ottoman Empire reformed. After the failed rebellions of the late 1800s, even the Young Turks denied them legal rights and equality with the remaining population. As the Ottoman Empire was at war and had suffered significant military defeats, the Armenians were an easy pick as scapegoats for all that had gone wrong. In response to a rebellion in Van that had been artificially aggravated by the Ottoman army, the Interior Minister of War made the decision to mass deport the Armenians. Enver Pasha, on May 2, 1915, gave his seal of approval to this via letter.
So keep in mind the context here. This is 1915. They're in the first half a year to a year of the First World War, but this is before I believe the Ottoman Empire has actually entered World War I. So this is right kind of on the cusp of their entrance into World War I. World War I has already broken out in Europe.
The Young Turks sought to remove the Armenians for nationalist reasons, on the grounds of removing an ethnicity from their society. But to achieve this, they went by a different means, appealing to the Islamic beliefs of the majority population. They called for a jihad against the non-believers and appealed to people to rid the empire of the kuffar. Lists were made of Armenian intellectuals and community leaders, camps established, soldiers were given orders, militias were armed, and camps built for the purpose. When the order was given, Armenian community leaders and intellectuals in urban areas were arrested and killed. Armenians were forced to leave their towns and deported south into the Syrian desert in forced marches. Up to 1.5 million Armenians died in the deserts of Syria, forced to march through the deserts or left in camps with neither food or water. They succumbed to thirst, hunger, and disease.
Now, a lot of them fought back. And because they fought back, they killed some of the people who were trying to destroy them, basically. That does not justify the mass extermination of over 1 million people. Well, they were killing us, so we had no choice. They were killing you because they were trying to stay alive.
Every genocide has its deniers. However, the traces of what happened cannot simply be wiped away. Travel through eastern Anatolia today and you will see the empty Armenian churches wherever you may go. The Armenian genocide is denied by the Turkish government and Turkish academia to this very day, and the society that cannot confront the demons of its past is a society that will be haunted by those demons. As such, we will encounter this genocide again in later chapters. The genocide in the end didn't help the Young Turks change the tide of war. As the Russian Empire collapsed, the Armenians in the east broke off to form their own republic, now even more hostile towards them. The Arabs rebelled en masse and harassed the Ottomans from Arabia to Damascus, something the British would take advantage of. And the British expeditionary force took Basra and Baghdad. In the end, the Young Turks only signed their own death warrant with what they had done. The world had noticed what had happened, and for what they had done they would, in case of defeat, not be able to merely surrender, but would be wanted men for the crimes that they had committed.
And that's something we already talked about in yesterday's episode, and so I will, in the playlist, I'll put these back in the proper order, so I'll put 6 before 7, even though I'll be kind of covering some of the same stuff in 7 since I didn't talk about it in 6 previously, but let me just say one last thing about this whole idea of genocide. Understanding that it happened and acknowledging that it happened does not mean that Turkish people today are to blame for that. Any more than German people are to blame for the Holocaust, any more than Americans today are to blame for what was done to the Native Americans. The sins of our past are just that. They're our past. As long as we acknowledge them and say, you know what, that was wrong, it shouldn't have happened, and do our best not to let it happen again, that's all we can do. We can't hold people responsible for what their great-grandparents did. It's wrong to do that as long as we acknowledge what's been done. So, Turkey, we love you. I know we've got a lot of fans in Turkey that follow this channel. I hope you continue to do so. I'm glad you're here. Let's continue this conversation. We'll be back tomorrow with Chapter 8. See you then.